morning. Please sit down.
Application 1 of 2016 on Commission Deliberations, 2016
Now, Mr Entry, can you continue to appear with Ms Purcell for the Minister?
I do, Acting Senior Commissioner.
Thank you. And Mr Moss with Ms Dudgeon for the CCI?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And Dr Diamond and Mr Dane this time for UnionsWA?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, following the adjournment of the hearing on the 24th of May, as requested, Mr Moss has forwarded to us the ABS labour force statistics that have detailed the full-time and part-time employees in WA by industry, in particular for February 2015 and 2016, so thank you for that. And we're convening today to deal with, firstly, to hear any submissions on the Fair Work Commission's annual wage review, and that decision was handed down on the 31st of May, and also to deal with the issue of the National Training Wage Award references within awards. And I note we received correspondence from Mr Moss late yesterday afternoon indicating that there had been agreement, so we'll deal with that also. So, Mr Entry.
Thank you, Acting Senior Commissioner. The Fair Work Commission has determined that the federal minimum wage and federal award wages will increase by 2.4% from the 1st of July this year. The Minister for Commerce notes that the Fair Work Commission's decision is partly based on economic and labour market data at the national level that was relatively positive. However, much of the national data informing the Fair Work Commission's deliberations is far more favourable than that currently applying in Western Australia. For instance, the latest federal budget forecasts for household consumption, dwelling investment and employment growth are all far stronger at the national level than they are in Western Australia. The Minister also notes that the data referred to in the National Wage Decision points to a significant downturn in mining investment and profitability, something that has a much larger impact on the West Australian economy and labour market than it does for Australia as a whole. The Fair Work Commission has observed that small businesses are more award reliant than larger businesses and will be particularly affected by changes in award rates of pay, and generally have less capacity to adjust to adverse changes in business conditions and have found it harder to bounce back from the global financial crisis than larger businesses. The Minister concurs with these observations and contends that they have relevance to the state wage case, as small businesses are far more likely to be covered by the state wage order than larger businesses. In terms of the impact of the National Wage Decision, in paragraph 492 of its decision, the Fair Work Commission reiterated its view that modest and regular increases in minimum wages have a small or even zero impact on employment. In the same paragraph, it also noted that there is legitimate disagreement about what constitutes a modest increase. And it said that we accept that this implies a lower increase in times when unemployment is relatively high and rising, and growth in employment and hours of work are relatively low. In Western Australia, growth is currently very weak and full-time employment is declining. The Department of Treasury has also forecast unemployment to be higher in 2016-17 than in 2015-16. The Minister contends that this lends weight to the argument that now is not a time for a significant wage increase to be awarded to the state minimum wage and state award wages. In the previous hearings on 24th of May, the Minister noted that the current economic environment is likely to be challenging for many businesses which have limited capacity to absorb significant increases in wage costs. The Minister contends this remains the case, particularly when economic and labour market statistics in Western Australia are contrasted with those at the national level. The National Wage Decision does not give rise to a change in the Minister's position in these proceedings, and the Minister remains of the view that a flat dollar increase of $8.50 per week is the most appropriate adjustment for state minimum wage and state award wages. The Minister notes that this position, if granted, would lead to a narrowing of the gap between the higher state minimum wage and the federal minimum wage. If an $8.50 per week increase were to be granted, the state minimum wage would rise to $688.40 a week, which would still be well above the new federal minimum wage of $672.70 per week. If it pleases the Commission or Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you.
Mr. Entrican, if I may, I think what you're telling us is that we should unpack the national data and break it down so that we have a picture of the state economy removed from the federal or national economy. Why can we not unpack the CPI in the same way?
Well, the CPI that everybody is using for this hearing is the per CPI, so it is already West Australian specific, if you like.
Yes, but there's resistance to unpacking it to see what factors that are used to make up the CPI have the greatest effect on the lowly paid.
Yes.
And there's resistance to unpacking it because we're told that it's a statistic and you've got to take the rough with the smooth in relation to statistics. Why can we not do the same in relation to...
Well, the national wage decision does affect millions of people throughout the country, and so most of the data that's used to inform the national wage decision is national economic and labour market data, whereas the state decision is focused solely within Western Australia and those organisations who are likely to be affected by it. So there's always been more of an emphasis on West Australian data for the state wage case than at the national level, where the state of the West Australian economy is only one consideration out of many different ones at the national level. But in Western Australia, it has a lot more prevalence.
I take that point. My point is one of logic. If we're going to unpack statistics at national level and look at them on a state level, why can we not unpack the state CPI?
With due respect, I don't see the correlation. I think one is focusing on the West Australian economy because it's a state wage case. I'm not sure that there's a correlation between not unpacking the CPI. It's CPI that we've used is state level in that regard.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Entrican.
Thank you.
Mr. Moss.
Thank you. As has been noted, the national wage case increase of 2.4% increases the national living wage to $672.70 per week, which still sits below the current state minimum wage. As the Minister's already noted, one of the clear considerations that the Fair Work Commission has given in granting the increase it has is, in its words, the general economic climate is robust with some continued improvement in productivity and historically low levels of inflation and wage growth. The prevailing economic circumstances provide an opportunity to improve the living standards of the low paid to enable them to meet their needs. The question from our perspective is whether this assessment of the national economy resonates with the situation facing the WA economy. In looking at the economy, the Fair Work Commission has highlighted some particular key issues. The first is the growth in gross domestic product. Now, WA's Treasury's economic outlook shows that national level forecast for real GDP growth is 2.5% for this financial year, up from the 2014-15 actual 2.2%. Treasury's forecast shows that in WA, gross state product is forecast at just 1% for this financial year, compared to 3.5% actual in 2014-15. Clearly, within the WA context, growth is not high compared to what's occurring nationally.
I think the December GDP figure nationally was revised upwards, wasn't it, to 3% for the December quarter 2015? Most recently released data, I think.
Quite
so it's actually a bit stronger than you've just suggested.
Yes, yes. So with the national, yes, you're quite correct. So The state final demand shows fairly much the same story, with WA experiencing a fall of 4.75% state final demand in the 12 months to December 2015. And you'll notice that the figures that were released 2 days ago, which has updated that data, shows a fall in state final demand of 1.2% in the last quarter in WA. So the downwards trend in state final demand is continuing within the Western Australian context. Queensland and Northern Territory in the 12 months to December 2015 also experienced declines of 1.66% and 17.64% respectively. And this contrasts sharply with New South Wales growth of 3.39% in December to 2015 and 1% growth through the quarter to March, and Victoria's growth of 4.59% to December 2015, which has stagnated with this quarter. So when viewed from a New South Wales Victoria perspective, the economy is indeed growing, and at a healthy rate. But this is not reflective of the country as a whole, and in particular it's not reflective of Western Australia. When we look at the concept of labour market conditions, the Fair Work Commission has emphasised that the labour market continues to be growing across almost all of the criteria. But once again, when we compare what's happening in Western Australia to the national averages, we're starting to see a different story. So for the majority of the past 12 months, unemployment rate in WA has been higher than the national average, and we're trending upwards, whereas nationally there's a clear decline in the unemployment rate. Nationally, employment grew by 2.03% to March 2016, compared to only 0.3% in WA. But when we consider full-time employment, nationally there was a 1.01% increase in full-time jobs, compared to a 2.7% decline in Western Australia. Nationally, the monthly hours worked across all jobs increased by 0.67% in the year to March 2016. In WA over the same period, they fell by 1.61%. Nationally, job vacancy rates have been growing. In WA, they're in decline. WA's underemployment rate has also reached a record high of 9.7% as of February 2016 in trend terms, compared to a declining national average of 8.9%. All of these measures show that the employment market within Western Australia is significantly weaker than what has occurred at the national level. The Fair Work Commission also identifies that all measures of inflation and wage growth are at historically low levels. However, they are noticeably lower in WA. So inflation in the 12 months to March 2016, Perth 0.8% compared to national 1.3%. Private sector wage growth is measured by a wage price index. In WA, 1.6% compared to 2% nationally. So you can see that quite clearly inflation and wage growth in WA is at much lower levels than we are seeing at the national level. As a result, the perceived strength of the national economy is clearly not reflected in the state of the WA economy. The Fair Work Commission has clearly given significant consideration as to whether the national economy can support an increase that gave greater consideration to the social objectives under the Fair Work Act. And this is not dissimilar to the approach adopted by the Commission in Court Session in awarding higher increases than the national increase when the WA economy was performing stronger. Given the change in the economic fortunes, we believe it's consistent with the state wage case objectives for the national wage case to catch up with the state minimum wage, national minimum wage to catch up with the state minimum wage, given the growth in the national economy relative to the challenges faced in the WA economy. The Fair Work Commission has given considerable regard to relative living standards of the low paid, and in particular the gap between the national minimum wage and average earnings. We would reaffirm our original view that this gap confirms that our system of employment is working in improving the living standards of Australians. In our original submissions, we referred to research which identified that only 1% of employees remain in low-paid employment up to 5 years, with 61.5% having left low-paid jobs within the first year. The challenge at the moment for WA workers is to obtain the level of paid employment that they seek, with both high levels of unemployment and underemployment.
Sorry, Mr. Moss, can I just ask you there, did you have detail on what happens to them after they leave low-paid employment?
Yep, so, so if you just bear with me for just one moment. In our submissions, we did provide some data on that. Or sorry, at least with our old submissions.
I think you found that the answer was that they at each of the intervals they left low-paid employment to go to higher-paid employment.
Yes, so now not all did. So what happens is, and the majority proportion moved to high-paid employment, higher-paid employment. There are some who then move to unemployment, and some who leave the labour force.
And where are those stats from?
Well, now these were statistics based on all the survey material that the Commonwealth Government put in its submissions to the National Wage Case.
Okay, so I think it's paragraph 512 of the Fair Work Commission decision recently.
It has made reference to that material, yeah.
Okay, so they note that there are two types of, say specifically young people who work at minimum wages, one full-time students often living at home or otherwise supported by families, very likely to move to higher, probably substantially higher paid jobs on graduation and to have a standard of living that exceeds their current low earnings. The other type has left education and is seeking full-time work and probably more reliant on own earnings. The duration of the low-paid work of this latter group was of particular concern, and noting welcoming evidence, and it's a slightly different point, but...
Yeah, and so the Fair Work Commission has clearly identified that their concern is less with people who move on and more with people who might remain in that essence. I think from our perspective it's quite clear that the majority of people who move into low-paid jobs do move on to higher-paid positions. And the proportion of people who remain in low-paid positions is quite low.
Are some people moving on to unemployment?
Well, so some people move back to unemployment and some people leave the labour force. And there's going to be a question as to why do people do that. To a certain extent, low-paid work is more precarious and more subject to replacement. So unemployment may not be voluntary in nature.
To a large extent?
Yes. It may be reflected on the person's ability to employment. Not everyone is cut out for employment. And that may also be reflected in those who choose to leave the labour market altogether. So it's going to be a variety of reasons, both potentially economic and personal, as to why people trend out of the employment aspect. But for those which remain, it seems quite clear that their prospects of then moving on into better paid jobs is very high, and a very small proportion remain in low paid employment. So our viewpoint is that whilst there needs to be some regard to those who remain in low paid employment, one of the key criteria from our perspective is to make sure people come into the workforce in the first instance. And our concern is that having a too high a bar to paid employment, that it declines people with the opportunity to move into those high paying roles.
Do you mind reminding me, you said a small proportion that remain in low paid work. What's that proportion?
Based on those statistics, it's 1%. So within 5 years, 99% have moved on or out. Yep. Thank you. The Fair Work Commission has noted that there's some concern that some award-reliant households may be below the poverty line. The example provided of this is found in paragraph 65 of their decision, in which they conclude that in December 2015, disposable income was less than 6% of median income poverty line for single earner couples where one partner earns the national minimum wage or the C10 rate and the other partner is not in the labour force and therefore not in receipt of the new start allowance. That's irrespective of whether they have children or not. And that's at table 5.6, page 98 of their decision. However, where the other partner is seeking employment, it's probably important to note that the result is different. So that the partner is seeking employment and therefore in receipt of the new start allowance, then they're equal to or above that poverty line indication, which is 1 in that table. So the reference to those sitting below the poverty line is a very specific and discrete example. And we also note that the Fair Work Commission has identified in paragraph 409 of its decisions that they also accept that increases in minimum wage are a blunt instrument for addressing the needs of the low paid, and other instruments are required to assist in the task of ensuring that every employed family, whatever their composition, has sufficient income to meet their material needs. They've also referenced comments from the OECD that has noted that minimum wage is a blunt instrument in addressing poverty, and that's at paragraph 414 of their decision. CCI submits that the example that the Fair Work Commission has identified is one which is best addressed through the tax transfer system. The minimum wage is not an effective means of addressing the needs of every type of household arrangement. In the example given, it's also relevant to consider why the other partner is not in the labour market. And we appreciate there's a variety of reasons why which that may be the case. But of course, one of those questions may well be whether or not the minimum wage has had some impact in establishing a barrier to employment.
Because you say it's too high and therefore there's less opportunity to be employed?
Yeah, there's always the potential, and I know this is a vexed question and one which there's no clear consensus or view on, but one of the concerns from the employer position is that in having a high minimum wage, then that sometimes denies people opportunity to get into the labour market, simply because it limits the roles that might be available. And we say that you're seeing the impact of that in part by the drying up of low-skilled, low-experience work. That increasingly those jobs are being mechanised, and as such it's more cost-effective to look towards use of technology to replace a lot of those low-skilled jobs. Hence why most of them now reside within the service-based industry, where replacement is not so easily achieved. And for us, we think that that's having those opportunities, those entryways into the labour market are effective and useful. The Fair Work Commission has also recognised that over the past 10 years, national minimum wage increased in real terms by 4.8%. That's at paragraph 375 of the decision. And based on the figures which are identified in that paragraph, over the past 5 years, the national minimum wage has increased by 3.03% in real terms. As identified in the hearings on the 24th, CCI has calculated that the state minimum wage has grown by 4.1% in real terms. We made comment that there was a 15.8% growth in the state minimum wage over the last 5 years compared to 11.7% growth in inflation. Low-paid workers in WA system have therefore benefited from higher real wage growth than those covered by the national system. The increase granted by the Fair Work Commission this year is essentially allowing the national system employees to catch up, not overtake. In the context of these proceedings, given the strength of the national economy relative to the WA economy, this approach has some validity. It is a reflection of the approach adopted by this Commission in previous years, in which it relied once again on the strength of the WA economy compared to the national economy to provide substantial real wage growth. The Fair Work Commission has also paid some regard to workforce participation and reaffirmed views that research on the impact of the minimum wage on employment is unclear. But But they are also mindful of the possibility that higher rates of growth can diminish the number of entry-level and low-skilled jobs over the longer term, and that's at paragraph 489 of their decision. And this is an issue that CCI is concerned about, as these jobs provide those with limited skills and experience the first step in the labour market and allows them to progress into those higher paid positions. We're also concerned that little regard or no regard appears to have been given by the Fair Work Commission to the Productivity Commission's concerns that adverse employment effects from minimum wage increases were felt more by would-be employees, that is, the unemployed, those outside the labour force, and for those already in jobs, for which the main consequence of the Productivity Commission appears to have been a reduction in the hours worked rather than job loss. This is also reinforced by the research undertaken by the Fair Work Commission itself with respect to the penalty rate matters, and which have been identified in our submissions, substantive submissions, which identified the short-term responses of employers to changes in labour costs, include reducing working hours and reducing staff through natural attrition. We believe that these are significant factors that should be considered by this Commission. We also believe that the current levels of underemployment in WA clearly identifies that there's not an undersupply of labour within WA, and therefore the concern that the Fair Work Commission had about ensuring the minimum wage was attractive to would-be employees is not a relevant consideration in the WA context. We'd also highlight the comment that the Minister made with respect to the Fair Work Commission identifying that their view is that there is legitimate disagreement about what constitutes modest increases to the minimum wage, and that when unemployment is relatively high and rising and growth in employment and hours of work is relatively low, then this would imply a lower increase. In WA, our outlook doesn't seem to even meet this low bar. We currently face relatively high unemployment, a decline in working hours, and a significant fall in full-time jobs. The Fair Work Commission has also looked at this as an opportunity with respect to seeking to reduce the gender pay gap. We reaffirm our original submissions that we're concerned that increasing the minimum wage may actually have the opposite effect, given the flowing impact of award wages through to EBA negotiations and wage increases generally. But even taking the view that increases do have a positive, modest impact, the question that arises is whether in the current economic climate, what level of consideration should be given to gender equality, given that it's generally accepted that gains and increases in minimum wage have, at best a modest impact on reducing the gender pay gap. To what level should that consideration be given to the other significant challenges facing the WA economy, and particularly those which are inhibiting employment?
There's also a suggestion, though, that part of the reason for a percentage pay rise is that women's rates of pay, where they're award covered as they progress through the awards, are better served by a percentage increase than a flat rate.
Yes. So insofar as, yes, that we work on the premise that women are more likely to be award-based employees, and that seems relatively clear, then a significant high increase will have a greater impact on those which are sitting on the higher classifications. And there would appear to be some logic associated with that. Having said that, one of the things that we think that doesn't necessarily contemplate is the flow-on effect that increases to minimum wages or to the award wages has with respect to wage growth more generally. So, as we noted in our original submissions, we're concerned that or there is the generally recognised concept of a flow-on effect of wage increases. That is, increases to the award wages will tend to signal what is an appropriate increase for those who are paid above awards. Normally on the premise that those who are paid above awards will want to maintain or seek to maintain that level of differentiation between their rate and the award rate, and it also has an impact upon enterprise agreement negotiations as well. We quite frequently see that the increases granted either through the national or state wage case tend to establish a floor in which parties representing employees in particular will not want to see negotiations fall below. Maybe it's quite simply, and this is me making an assumption on behalf of the viewpoints of unions, if the union can't negotiate an increase above what was granted through the state or state and national wage case provisions, then that potentially reflects poorly on the union's ability to negotiate. So in practice, that tends to be what we see. That in itself then, I think, dilutes the impact granted through such an approach.
Surely that depends on the economic climate generally. I'm wondering how these things fit together where flow-on effect to the extent that it's not mandatory versus times are so tough that employers would be not employing people or reducing hours.
That's right.
That conceptually doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, and this is where the issue of negotiation and bargaining power starts to come in. Unfortunately, we do frequently see the concept or situation where, through the relative triggers within the industrial relations system, significant pressure can be put onto employers to capitulate claims which may not make a lot of sense from a productivity or an economic perspective because of the risk of things like industrial action or other disruptions.
I think, though, we've seen in the last 18 months in particular a moderating of pay claims and of the terms of settlement of those EBAs. I would be surprised if, except in fairly limited circumstances, there's not an acceptance that there's less to go around in state bargaining.
And that's something that we've been working very hard to try and put that perception out there. And it's not always been an easy sell. There has been a lot of resistance in negotiating enterprise agreements for employees to accept significantly lower wage increases through EBA negotiations than what they had received previously. So it's not without its challenges. I think quite, looking at things from an outside perspective, conceptually you identify the economy is not performing as well, and as such then the benefits that the employees will gain as a result of EBA negotiations should be of a lesser standard. But when you've got employees who've been used to 5 and 5.5% pay increases for a significant number of years, when it actually comes to convincing them that a 2 or 1.5% increase is appropriate, that becomes quite challenging. And those negotiations, whilst a lot of agreements are now getting through with significantly lower pay increases, negotiations are frequently very protracted, and quite frequently there's a level of disruption arising out of those negotiations. And that disruption is sometimes in the case of industrial action, threatened industrial action, and in other cases it's more of a subtle form. Our concern is a high increase to the state minimum wage will in effect undo some of those efforts that employers have been endeavouring to keep wage growth moderate. The net effect, unfortunately, is if wage growth isn't moderate and employers are still under the pressure to reduce costs, then they're reduced in other manners. And that's usually a reduction in staff. So the concern is that short-term pressures will sometimes result in employers unfortunately agreeing to things that in hindsight might not be an appropriate method of address.
Mr. Moss, if I can pick up on that, I address this to both you and in time I'll hear from Dr. Diamond about it. This issue of signalling, which you're now talking about, I think. Under Section 50A, we have a particular responsibility and a particular duty to consider several matters. And under 3A Roman 5, there's the need to protect employees who may be unable to reach an industrial agreement. Now, if we take too much account of the signal that the state minimum wage may send to those who are able to reach an industrial agreement, does not the Commission end up simply vacating the field in terms of providing what we consider to be the proper minimum wage to those who are unable to reach industrial agreement? And I'll seek Dr. Diamond's comment on it too. Do you see my point? If we worry too much about signalling and grant a minimum wage increase that takes account of signalling because of the message you might send to those who can organise, do we not essentially abandon the field for those who can't?
I don't believe so, and that's principally on the premise that there's a range of objectives that the Commission needs to take into consideration, and I think it's relatively it's been well recognised that these considerations can, in part, almost act against each other in that they're not complementary. Furthermore, the level of weight or consideration that the Commission Court session gives to each of the criteria with respect to can vary depending on the year. So clearly the Commission Court session must give consideration to all of the objectives. It can't ignore any of the objectives, but it can give greater weight to one or more than others in various years given the degree of circumstances. So conceivably, greater regard can be given to catching up, say, award-based employees with where other employees may well be. That may be a greater consideration where economic times are better, and less of a consideration at times when economic circumstances are less. So it's not an aspect of vacating the field, it's to what level of weight of consideration does one give it. And our concern is that the low paid are the most vulnerable with respect within the labour market. It's the low paid who tend to are more likely to suffer a reduction in hours or loss of employment or less opportunity for employment than more skilled workers.
All right. Well, what if the Commission in Court session, just to comment on this, said in state wage cases, this is not intended as a signal to those who can organise, and this is not intended as a signal to employers, with the responsibility then being on employers and unions to not misuse, if I can put it that way, what is intended to be an increase to the minimum wage for low-paid employees. Being unrealistic in thinking that that would be useful.
I would not suspect that would have any significant impact on it.
Would that be our fault?
No. It would just be a natural consequence in that respect. Looking at the detail of things like state wage case decisions and national wage case decisions, so we'll take the national wage case decision as an example, 160 odd pages. One can expect very few people will actually read the full detail of the decision. Most people will simply look for the headline. And when we're looking at things like EBA negotiations, when people are looking at identifying what are perhaps the benchmarks or flags for what should be considered, one looks at the headlines. One doesn't go through to the detail.
All right, and why I have you, Mr. Moss, if you don't mind, the state economy, you tell us, is not doing as well as the national economy. If we then drill deeper into the areas most likely, or the industries most likely to employ low-paid employees and be affected by an increase in the state minimum wage, being retail, accommodation and food services, rental, hiring and real estate services, administrative and support services, I covered them, basically.
Yes, I think you have so.
How's the economy going for those industries? To what extent can you help us? Maybe you can help us a lot, not a lot.
Yep.
What can we tell us?
I don't have any detail specifically to hand at the moment. Our original submission did make some reference to the retail and hospitality industry in a number of regards.
Well, you've given us the profit, the gross operating term escapes me, but the measure of profitability for those industry groups, and I think we have the employment data for the various industries.
Yeah.
Is there anything more that might be
available? There's nothing more that I can add with respect to that other than that material. Of course, the other thing that I would note in the context of the state wage case proceedings is that those employers, private sector employers who fall within those industries, by the nature of the type of entities that they are, either sole traders or partnerships, are small business as well. And one of the things that, and we have provided this in our submissions as well, routinely identified is small business has more difficulties than larger businesses in dealing with changes in economic circumstances. So when we are looking at the state of the WA economy, we are looking at that quite broadly. And generally speaking, for small businesses, there will be greater challenges within that context.
And the GOS and GMI is only a proxy. There's no specific data on individual firm profitability, but it's a proxy for overall industry performance. That's about as high as we can put it.
It's quite correct, sir. It doesn't take into account what a particular business will be facing. And of course then you've got an averaging component of small, medium and large businesses within that particular mix there too. So one would expect that the gross operating profits of Coles and Woolworths, which are clearly in the retail space, are vastly different to the small business selling fruit and vegetables. With respect to the means of increase percentage versus flat, we noticed that with the Fair Work within the National Annual Wage Review, there was significant support for a percentage increase amongst a number of both union and employer parties, which is not the case in the context of these proceedings, in which both Minister and CCI support a flat dollar increase. And we think in the current economic circumstance, a flat increase better targets the low paid. In essence, CCI believes that even were this Commission to be mindful of Fair Work's consideration of the benefit of a substantial increase in improving the relative living standards and gender equality, we note that the Fair Work Commission has only considered this appropriate based on an assessment of the relative strength of the national economy. And we contend this is not reflected in the WA context.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but how does that apply in terms of the point you made about particular economies within the national economy not faring as well? So clearly WA, you would say, is one of them. And effectively, I understood you were saying New South Wales and Victoria doing a lot better than everybody else.
Yep.
But the other economies are affected by the national minimum wage.
They are. And I suppose this is one of the difficulties or issues associated with a national assessment, is it's based on the national data. Now, if we're looking nationally, the two biggest economies are New South Wales and Victoria, and so therefore they have a more significant effect on what the overall national outcomes are for probably the majority of stats, not all. So in looking at this, the Fair Work Commission perhaps is almost looking through a prism which is more dominated by the New South Wales and Victorian economies than it is within the other economies. So that's not to say the other economies aren't necessarily growing. There's been some growth in Tasmania. My understanding is South Australia is still fairly stagnant. Queensland and Northern Territory, once again both resource states, have also seen declines in things like state final demand. so aren't faring quite as well. So in looking at it from a national aspect, they are looking at it from the overall averages, and New South Wales and Victoria have a significant effect to play on that. And the level of confidence within those economies is much greater than what it is over here. On casual observation of how optimistic people are feeling, it's high over there. And that's reflected in things like the business expectation surveys and consumer confidence surveys, which tend to show that from a national aspect, there is a greater level of confidence than is reflected when the same surveys or similar surveys are conducted over here.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
So in essence, we feel that the decision of the Fair Work Commission is largely reflective of the optimism that they see in the growth of the national economy, as I mentioned before, that which is largely felt on the East Coast. And the decision is made in the context of an economy which has shown signs of improvement. This is in strong contrast to the WA economy, which is dealing with challenges of declining economic performance and a struggling labour market. May I please Commission Court session that will use those views with respect to the national wage case. Would you prefer us to deal with the traineeship issue at this point? Or
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With respect to the traineeship, and I do apologise that it was only sent late yesterday afternoon, the parties have had some discussion about what wording, if anything, is appropriate to be inserted into the awards which reference the National Training Wage Award.
Yes.
And we've come up with a mode of wording which is that within those awards will deal with a single paragraph referencing the National Training Wage Award, that below that paragraph be inserted the words, except that where pay rates in the National Training Wage Award apply, a trainee shall not be paid less than the rate in paragraph 6b of the State Wage Order that apply to a trainee to whom an award does not apply. We believe that will give a clear indication to employees, particularly in the private sector, employees in the private sector, that there is more to this question than we need to answer. We have had some discussions about whether this should be inserted into all awards or simply the private sector awards. The parties now agreed that it's appropriate really for them just to be inserted within the private sector awards. The Minister has kindly provided that prepared a list of that, which might be preferable if we send to Chambers rather than read out here, if that's more appropriate.
Well, I had actually marked them for my own purposes to identify. But in any event, you're going to, the Minister or you is going to provide a schedule of those awards to which the paragraph that you've agreed ought to go in.
Yes, and they are simply the private sector awards.
Private sector awards.
Yeah. There's a view of the Minister and the other parties, and we'll just give them up, that speaks for itself, I suppose, for that. Confer that there's not a need to reflect it within the public sector awards. There's sufficient within the public sector to identify this, and there are other documents in play within the public sector which deal with those in a different way. So there's not a concern that within the public sector there will be an issue of compliance with this. Simply within the private sector, for those employers who may not know what the minimum rates will be.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you, Commissioner. May it please the Commission in Court session. As a result of the Fair Work Panel's decision, UnionsWA's position on an increase to the state minimum wage remains the same. So that's for $30 per week for lower award rates from C14 to C10 with a 3.9% percentage increase for the higher rates. We continue to rely on our substantial written submissions, but certainly we'd like to bring some aspects of the national decision to the Commission's attention that we feel are relevant to state wage case considerations. Before I begin, a question on the difference between or monetary difference between the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage. Look, we have a view that essentially, we have a view obviously on what the national minimum wage increase should have been in our view. We were certainly supporting the ACTU's position, and we also have a view on what the state minimum wage increase ought to have been. And both of those, along with other factors, were certainly based on our view about the percentage of a minimum wage compared to average weekly earnings, an average weekly earnings component. And we see that in both the state wage case criteria and, where it's appropriate, the national wage case criteria as being sort of similar. So in that sense, the gap, or the overall size of the gap between the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage, it's not a specific consideration, or it's listed as a specific consideration within the Act. So we're proceeding on the basis of what we believe what we believe the state wage increase ought to be. That being said, UnionsWA, along with the ACTU, certainly welcomes a rise in wages in a situation where, as the Fair Work panel noted in its decision, paragraph 40, that there's a continuing historically low aggregate wage growth. Now, this particular national increase is less than the 2015 national increase, which was about $16 per week, and still wasn't enough, in our view, to close the growing gap between average and minimum wages, which we believe is putting enormous pressure on the lowest paid. National minimum wage will now be around 44% of average weekly ordinary time earnings.
Sorry, what was that percentage?
The national minimum wage will now be around 44% of the average weekly ordinary time earnings, so the WAIRC measure. That being due mainly to wage growth being flat across the board. UnionsWA argues that in the discussion of the evidence that's cited in the Fair Work Commission's decision, based on that evidence, we feel that the panel should have awarded a larger minimum wage increase, closer to the ACTU claim, to address that aforementioned growing gap between the minimum wage and average weekly earnings, or to reverse the metaphor slightly, the reducing bite of the minimum wage compared to average weekly earnings. And with that in mind, looking at some of the national decision, looking at some of the considerations for the state wage order that we feel are relevant, particularly issues around having a system of fair wages and conditions of employment, we draw the Commission's attention to paragraph 15 of the Fair Work panel's decision statement, which says that despite some recent improvement in relative living standards of award-reliant employees, the relative position of low-paid workers has deteriorated over the past decade. Moving on substantially to the paragraph 372, the Commission lists some actual long-term data that's supplied by the Australian Government to support this point. Namely that from when it was introduced in 1997 until 2015, the national minimum wage has increased by average of 3.4% a year in nominal terms, whereas median full-time earnings, and I'm just sort of pause and note that's the median measure rather than the average measure, has averaged about 4.4% in nominal terms. Therefore, there's been a decline in that minimum wage bite when considered as a median from 62% in 1997 to 53% over that period. And looking at real weekly earnings for full-time adult employees, the growth rates were highest among the higher paid, and there's been far lesser growth, particularly if you look at it from the point of view of the lowest percentile of real weekly household disposable income. And the decision also references the Gini coefficient as a measure of inequality, and noting that that's risen over the last couple of decades, and as we pointed out in our initial submission, the WA GNI coefficient has grown as well. So with that in mind, while in both WA and in Australia there has been some more recent moderation in terms of the growth of the gap between average weekly earnings and the minimum wage, we see very little sign that the overall trend has been reduced, and neither did the Fair Work panel. And it's worth noting at this point that the Fair Work panel has actually flagged consideration of a medium-term target for the national minimum wage. That's based on a submission that was made by the United Voice Union. That's going to be considered, as I understand it, as part of the next review rather than this review. But it's worth flagging that the Fair Work panel considered that sort of sufficiently important to list it. Now, looking at the state of the national economy, to the extent that it is relevant, as is the statement that it says in the WA Act, the Fair Work panel made the following point in its paragraph 18, that the general economic climate is robust, with some continuing improvements in productivity and historically low levels of inflation and wage growth. The prevailing economic...
Sorry, you're referring to the statement rather than the full decision in your reference to the paragraph numbering.
Oh, I do beg your pardon.
No,
yes,
no, that's fine. I'm just clarifying that that's what it is.
Fine. Sorry about that.
Not at all.
Yes, look, essentially the prevailing economic circumstances provide an opportunity to improve relative living standards of the low paid. Now, it is certainly the case, as the other parties have mentioned, that WA has a distinct economy and has its own distinct set of economic data. We do think, however, that the national economy is relevant when you consider, for example, the Treasury's forecast of WA gross state product. Probably easiest to think about that as on page 5 of the Minister's presentation, or Treasury Witness's presentation, where they're basically showing that WA gross state product, while lower in the long run average, is nevertheless continuing to grow. And on the question of state final demand, which would be on page 7, the second chart on page 7 of that same presentation, certainly there's some decline in state final demand, but there's also forecast growth at an outer period. So essentially, at both the national level and the WA level, there's not a prediction of an outright recession or an outright going backwards. That would be the bare minimum. And certainly there's still an expectation that certainly an expectation that the economy will be perhaps starting from a lower base, but nevertheless will still be sort of in positive territory. It's not my intention to sound Panglossian about that, but what I'd put to you is that the argument about comparing the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage and thinking about the different levels that which is basically what we have at this situation. It's not simply about a simple point system, how well the state economy is going versus how well the national economy is going. The Commission is tasked specifically with other considerations, and that includes relative living standards and relative living standards in the context of living standards generally, fair wage standards, insofar as WA has experienced larger wages, larger average earnings, all of that sort of thing. It's worth, but part of the difference between the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage is about those sorts of considerations, not simply sort of how well the economy is doing necessarily at any given point, though obviously the Commission needs to consider that.
Yes, in fact the Fair Work Commission decision defined, in considering the various issues, groups some into economic and some into social,
yes.
Which I suppose one could do in terms of the criteria that is set under Section 50A(3). Yes.
That is possible. Yes.
But although historically, of course, in this jurisdiction, a significant component of the gap has been driven by the strength of the state economy over the last 5 years relative to the national economy. So that has played a role in that differential.
I certainly accept that. I would say, though, that what's also played a role as well is considerations about the cost of living in Western Australia as well. That's certainly what both UnionsWA and also WAIRC have based many of their
They tend to go hand in hand, don't they? Obviously, in a robust economic environment, inflation tends to be higher, so the cost of living tends to be higher. Wages tend to be higher. It's an overall atmospheric that applies.
No, that's certainly the case, definitely. But turning once again to the national economy, look, essentially, we would note that recent national accounts data that's come out, so earlier this week, has achieved results consistent with the panel's assessment, with the Fair Work panel's assessment, with annual growth in the Australian economy rising significantly to 3.1% from 2.8% in the 2015 calendar year. The Australian Bureau of Statistics also said that service-based industries were a big contributor to growth, with finance and insurance going at about 1.8%, retail trade, accommodation and food services 1.5%, arts and recreation 0.9%, all increasing. And household spending rose about 0.4%, which was unchanged in that December period. So that household spending aspect was not growing perhaps as much as those other sections. Now, the panel references a Reserve Bank research paper that was released earlier this year that sets out the performance of what they call the non-mining tradable sector and the non-tradable sectors of the economy. So that's 23% and 72% of the economy accordingly, and that's at their paragraph 222 of the decision. Essentially, they're showing that those three sectors are affected quite differently by the large changes in the terms of trade and the exchange rate. The non-mining tradable sector has been assisted by a fall in the exchange rate, and both it and the non-tradable sector have been assisted by low interest rates. And they quote the report to basically point out that imports of services, so thinking about it as a services sector, have declined as Australians appear to have switched some of their expenditure to domestically produced services, including, for example, domestic holidays rather than overseas holidays. So some of the smaller businesses that conceivably might be affected by this decision would certainly be part of that sector. So looking at wage growth, so I'm referring to the decision's paragraph 251. The panel concluded that wage growth is neither currently a source of inflationary pressure within the economy nor is a source of declining capacity of Australian firms to compete in international markets. That was true last year and that is true this year. And looking specifically at levels of economic growth, referring to some of the stuff we did beforehand, it points out at 336, economic growth, while remaining slightly below trend, has certainly continued at a reasonable level. And they go on in their paragraph 346 to point out that economic data in respect to award-reliant industries does not suggest that most award-reliant industries have faced a relatively difficult environment over the past year, or that recent minimum wage increases have adversely impacted on the relative economic performance of award-reliant industries. And some of the two, and I might just add, or I might just refer the Commission to perhaps the UnionsWA's initial submission, specifically some of our sections around paragraphs 1110 to 1113, where we do have bearing in mind the difficulties of finding information in this area, we did have a bit of a stab at trying to establish how smaller businesses might be performing under current conditions, or at least the conditions over the last few years. Specifically looking at the WA businesses operating at the end of each financial year with 1 to 19 employees, which we took as a proxy for a smaller business, seeing that it's certainly by no means a negative picture in terms of how these businesses have operated in some subdued circumstances, while they've nevertheless conceivably had some impact on a higher, conceivably been operating under the relatively higher state minimum wage system. And similarly, we also had a stab there at our paragraph 1111 at looking at the number of bankrupts with a business-related bankruptcy, which is both at the WA level and the national level, at least in the financial year just gone, seem to be sort of going down rather than going up. So once again, acknowledging the difficulties there is in finding information in this area, we nevertheless sort of draw that to the Commission's attention. And to simply point out that all of the official sources for expect gross domestic product and employment to continue to grow and unemployment to continue to fall. That's certainly something that the national wage decision referred to. And notwithstanding the differences within the WA economy, WA is still part of the national economy. The national decision still has to take account of the entire economy, and certainly the WA government made a submission asking the Commission specifically to do that. So looking at some of the points about providing equal remuneration to men and women for work of equal and comparable value. So that's the consideration that's within the State Act. The panel made the point in paragraph 16 of its statement that women continue to be overrepresented among the award-reliant and the low-paid. It follows that increases in the minimum wage can provide some assistance in addressing the gender pay gap. And the decision goes on to say that, an increase to award rates of pay relative to other wages would reduce the gender pay gap in two ways. One would be to raise the level of low pay rates relative to median rates. That particularly benefits women. And the second is to increase the higher levels of award rates, would particularly benefit women for some of the reasons that's been discussed here today. And we point out as well, of course, that bearing that in mind, WA does have a larger gender pay gap than the national gap. So insofar as we're considering specific WA factors, the fact that there's a larger gender pay gap in WA does, in our view, point to the need for a higher minimum wage in Western Australia than the national figure, and in that sense a larger increase. Looking to address some of the criteria around the needs of the low paid, the panel makes an important point about these relative needs, specifically in its paragraph 63, where they say we do not accept the proposition that most low-paid workers are not in low-income households. Many low-paid workers live in households with low or very low disposable incomes. With that in mind, they rejected the idea, and therefore rejected the idea generally, that you should simply assume, and we also address this in our initial submission, that you should assume that simply because the distribution of low-paid workers is enough to assume that a low to no wage increase is probably okay. We don't accept that. The panel also made a point about work hours and underemployment, in particular whether workers with fewer hours necessarily desire more, and that's at their paragraph 278. The Commission cites some recent research about the mismatch between the number of hours that people say they wish to work and the number that they actually work. People often say that they want to work fewer hours. They often say that many more people say they want to work fewer hours than say they want to work more hours. So in terms of the overall distribution of preference, it's not necessarily the case that it's always on the side of wanting to work more hours. And the researchers concluded that about half of those part-time workers who wish to work more hours in 1 year were actually happy with their hours a year later, whereas with about 35% still wish to work longer hours the following year. So our purpose for bringing that up is to note that while the issue of underemployment is certainly not one we want to diminish, and certainly other parties have addressed that, we simply sort of caution against making an assumption that sort of reductions in hours, particularly when employers and employees bargain, if you could put it like that, around sort of relative hours, that necessarily assuming that a reduced amount of hours that comes as a consequence of a larger pay increase is necessarily a bad thing and necessarily something that people are against at all levels. The panel also makes the point about in assessing the needs of the low paid and looking at their paragraph 352. The assessment of the needs of the low paid requires an examination to the extent to which low paid workers are able to purchase the essentials for a decent standard of living and to engage in community life assessed in the context of contemporary norms. With that in mind, UnionsWA reiterates its point that a CPI inflation headline rate, which is often what increases are judged around, is simply not an appropriate measure, or it's not a measure that can capture all of those considerations that are distinctive to the low paid. The low paid, needs of the low paid are a distinctive point in the Act, a distinctive consideration, and they're not captured by the CPI aspect. We've made some attempts to unpack some of the costs, but and in the case of the national wage decision, they have made an attempt to, they have increased it above consumer price index inflation level. Now, with that in mind, we would turn a bit to the paragraph 414 of the Fair Work Commission. That's the discussion which was quoted as containing words to the effect that the minimum wage is a blunt instrument. Now, blunt instruments aren't always a bad thing. There's
It depends who's on the receiving end of it, I suppose,
indeed.
doesn't it?
So this is probably where our choice of metaphor begins to break down a bit. Because the research that had been found consistently around the world, consistently around OECD countries, particularly in the OECD research that's cited by the Commission, by the Fair Work panel itself, basically shows that, a correlation between inequality and the minimum wage bite is very strong, and that's strong both in Australia and across OECD countries. And the OECD research does suggest that the minimum wage, notwithstanding its bluntness or otherwise, minimum wage increases can reduce poverty. It has certainly never been a contention of anyone that the minimum wage does all the work, but it is still nevertheless the case that without a strong minimum wage, nothing else can work, or nothing else is going to work, whether you do it through a tax transfer system, whether you do it through a social wage, without a national minimum, without a strong minimum wage. Simply, your measures to address inequality simply aren't going to be as effective, or if they're effective at all. With that in mind, the Fair Work panel also found, as has been previously discussed, that moving to higher paid work is not a given for low wage workers. With that in mind, a substantial number, it points out in its paragraph 516, that a substantial number of low wage workers either remain in low paid work for a number of years or move between low paid work and no work. The panel concluded that it cannot be indifferent to the standard of living of low paid workers just because many do not stay in that situation within long periods. And in that sense, we regard this as something that certainly applies both in WA and in Australia as a whole.
And in the meantime, they still have to have a decent standard of living.
That would be our contention, definitely. So, with regard to the question of whether the WA award framework represents a system of fair wages and conditions of employment, certainly we reiterate the point that the structure of our claim, with a flat dollar increase for the lower rates and a percentage increase for the higher rates, does provide a formula or provide an approach that addresses some of those issues of helping the low paid, but also maintaining the award relativity. So, to reiterate the earlier point, given that we would, if indeed we would like people to be moving off low paid into higher paid jobs, into higher paid work, I should say, maintaining the quality and maintaining the relativities of those award rates is an important consideration, and certainly something that the Commission should take into account. And notwithstanding improvements in their absolute position, if you refer to paragraph 462 of the statement, it basically suggests that the low paid and award reliant have fallen behind wage earners and employee households generally in the past decade. And that's been a record, that's been demonstrated by issues such as the rising Gini coefficient, which we mentioned earlier on. And this is despite the operations of the tax transfer system, which, as UnionsWA has argued, is not something that should be seen as an alternative or just something else you use instead of the minimum wage to improve the distribution of income. It should be something that seen as working complementary, and that's certainly how it's intended to work in Australia. On the question of the employment effects of the minimum wage increases, well, look, the panel does address the vexed question, and it certainly argues that there's very little evidence on this point in the academic literature, insofar as the Australian Chamber of Commerce was trying to draw the Commission's attention to a research paper on this topic. Even that found that there was very little disemployment as far as an initial raise in the short term. There might be something in the long term based on certain modelling, but as I think we had a discussion in the initial appearance of this the other week, that nothing really should be considered as staying the same. There's always something moving, always something happening, always an adjustment within the economy, especially over a long period of time. So to conclude, now UnionsWA in its initial submission has pointed to the Federal Treasury as identifying that low wage growth is being a drag on taxation receipts and on demand generally within the Australian economy. And we would argue that low wage growth is also such a drag on the WA economy as well. Given the current economic climate in which there is pressure pushing against wages growth, there's a clear economic case for raising minimum wages as a tool for economic growth. And we're particularly looking at we're having to think about the small role that household consumption expenditure, domestic spending is having so far in maintaining the economic position of Australia. We cited in our initial submission a report from the Economic Policy Institute of the USA, which found that the immediate benefits of a minimum wage increase are in the boosted earnings of lower paid workers, and its positive effects would far exceed that extra income. And it's generally recognised that low wage workers are more likely than any other group to spend their extra earnings immediately on the previously unaffordable basic needs or services. And that will be particularly significant, we think, in maintaining sort of levels of economic activity both in WA and Australia as a whole. So with that in mind, we continue to request an increase of $30 a week in the lower award rates from C10 to C14 and 3.9% for higher rates. And that would conclude our submissions on this matter, but we're happy to take questions.
Well, I think I have to ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Moss at the microphone moment. Does UnionsWA consider that a flat dollar increase, if awarded, should be converted to a percentage once converted to a percentage rather, should be seen as a signalling device for employers and for organised labour?
Well, in a sense,
Should, not will.
Should, not will. Well, we do refer to signalling in our initial submission, but we perhaps use signalling in a slightly different way. What we actually would consider, the signalling role is the signal it sends out to lower wage workers and workers who are in those sort of employed in the small businesses, employed in those sort of lower paid areas, basically to demonstrate that that's what you're actually meant to be paid. And the signalling impact is something that we felt was particularly important given sort of the results that we could find in our fair pay survey, which we included as part of our initial submission, that a lot of people were simply not in a situation where they were being paid correctly. It certainly didn't sound like, certainly didn't seem that many of them were receiving A, very much, and B, the correct rate either. Now, to some extent that's an information problem, but it's also a question of there has to be, these sorts of workers need a signal. They need something that's out there that says this is what you are going to be paid. This is the minimum. This is the area that you're...
If you meant that by signalling, I need to recast the question then.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a flat dollar increase, if one were awarded, and it were then converted to, say, 2%,
Yep.
in UnionsWA's view, should that be used by organised labour to go to employers and say, our pay increase, when we next negotiate for one, has to be more than 2%, because low-paid labour got 2%, we're more valuable than them, at least 2%.
Well, that's...
Should
that happen? Well, Commissioners, our argument is that wages growth generally is too low. We've made that point about sort of the wage price index. We've made that point about average weekly earnings. We've certainly made that point as far as the sort of trends in federal wage agreements, which are certainly sort of outside of this jurisdiction, but nevertheless sort of the largest area.
Mine's a question about organised labour pointing to the minimum wage decision. Not saying for other reasons wage growth is too low, but should organised labour be pointing to the minimum wage decision and saying at least this, definitely not less?
We don't have a specific policy on that, but I would say that a minimum standard is a minimum standard, and insofar as the Commission, insofar as workers and employers in a bargaining situation are likely to look at the state wage case decision, they can certainly interpret this as something that they should be asking for initially. But then the case would need to be made, because we don't believe it should be a hard and fast rule. The case would need to be made by employers that a 2% increase, for example, is not appropriate for this workplace. We're committed to collective bargaining. We're committed to the parties coming up with their own situation. But we firmly believe as well that the award system has to provide a basic underpinning. And you should be looking at the award system. Any union that goes out to bargain should certainly be referencing the award system and be looking to preserve that. But if they choose, and it's very much up to the bargaining committee then, if they choose to go with something that says that references the minimum wage case, then it's up to the employers to basically make the case as to why that's not the situation and that's not appropriate.
Well, then can we put the flow-on effect to one side then?
Okay. Can you put the flow-on effect to one side?
Mm.
I would suggest that you should look at the flow-on effect slightly differently and look at that point about the signalling to low-wage workers. That is the flow-on effect that I think that we would put it to you that the Commission should be more concerned about.
It's not a signal for them, it's an answer for them. I mean, this is what you're getting.
Well, certainly this is what you get, but this is at least what you get. Certainly there should be grounds if we're encouraging bargaining. It certainly should be the case that they can ask for more than the minimum wage, and that's what the award wages and award rates reflect that. Those sorts of workers, insofar as they have a capacity to bargain, which if they're ununionised, if they're single people, is obviously going to be limited. That's the signalling effect that the Commission should be concerned about. Signalling effect that goes to organised workers. Organised workers, be they in the public sector or the private sector, have a bunch of other considerations to deal with as well. And it's also the case that the employers, if they feel that whatever the union is asking for, the union is claiming is too much, it's up to them to make the case that it's inappropriate or it's wrong. The idea that might be...
There could be an obligation on the union, organised labour, to not ask for more than the minimum wage, so that people on the minimum wage can catch up.
Well, that is...
Because it undermines your bite argument, doesn't it? If you're going to use the increase in the minimum wage converted to a percentage as the start point for organised labour, then the bite's never going to be closed, is it? Or sorry, the bite's never going to expand.
I don't think that the bite is always going to be dependent on the outcomes of bargaining, or to some extent, the bite is always going to have to follow general wage growth within the community. The issue of whether particular workers in particular industries or particular businesses feel emboldened to start bargaining for something higher than what they want, is frankly a matter for the parties in that workplace and in that industry. Insofar as the Commission is tasked to look at an overall performance of the economy, overall wage levels, overall living standards, that is what the Commission, we would see, the Commission has to base its decision on. In that sense, but given that you're also supposed to look at the needs of the low paid and fair wage standards in the context of living standards generally, the role of the Commission is to think about how your increase affects signals, if you like, to the lowest paid. That is the signalling effect. Whatever happens when parties bargain between them, and it's up to the parties to come to an arrangement, they operate within a legal framework, they operate within considerations of all of that. That is what free collective bargaining is supposed to be about. The point about increasing for people who don't have that capacity or have limited capacity to bargain, who are in that low paid area, that is what the Commission is primarily about, in our view. And that's the signalling that the Commission should be thinking about, rather than just sort of whether somebody in a workshop down in Henderson or in a supermarket in the northern suburbs looks at a particular wage increase and says, oh, we'd like that. That is not something that the Commission, we think, should be thinking about. You shouldn't be trying to second or third guess all of these bargains that might be happening all around the place. The Commission should be thinking about the needs of the low paid in the context of living standards generally, and whatever signalling effect there is should be about the signal to the lowest paid, in our view.
Is that not easy to do if UnionsWA disavows the use of the increase in minimum wage for pushing for increases in Henderson and the
the thing is, we don't avow or disavow those particular sort of aspects. Those are matters for the parties. Those are matters for our affiliates. Our affiliates make the best possible assessment of what they feel they can bargain for in any given time. We don't, in that sense, set out a wages policy for our affiliates. We have general points that we're concerned about with the industrial relations system. We're obviously concerned about the minimum wage. We're obviously concerned about things like penalty rates. We're concerned about sort of the general industrial relations legal environment, but we don't seek to go out and give specific instructions to our affiliates about sort of, okay, so this year you should ask for this. We don't do that. So the question of sort of how affiliates view the minimum wage decision is really up to them. We don't seek to second guess what they propose to do, nor for that matter do we feel that given the confines of the Act, that the panel or the Commission should necessarily try and second guess that. What we're concerned about is the impact on the low paid and that signalling aspect for the low paid.
Thank you, Dr. Donovan.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. Before you sit down, is there anything you want to add in respect of the issue of the amending of those awards in respect of the National Training Wage Award?
Look, I think the other parties have essentially set out what the situation is. What we basically we sort of reserve the right, if you like, to sort of study the effects of it over the next year.
Yes.
And yes, we could conceivably come back and have a look at it to see if it's working smoothly. But hopefully we won't need to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Entrican, do you have a schedule for us of those awards, or you'll provide that to us sometime today?
Yes, Commissioner, I can provide you with those awards. Certainly, we'll forward that through too.
Thank you. Anything further? All right. Thank you all for your submissions. We'll adjourn now and advise you as soon as we're able as to our decision, and you can be assured that it is the Commission's priority. Thank you all.